Hey Vivek, good morning. How are you doing?
Hey Gigi, I'm doing great. It's actually a pleasure, talking to you again.
Thanks for coming back, Vivek. I've had loads of subscribers of my channel asking me for this session. So I know there's at least 7 people who I promised this would be live in 24 hours. So thanks. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Awesome, perfect. Let's dig into it.
Let's go, let's go. So what I'll do, I just want to introduce you because a whole bunch of people will have already seen the video that we did on SDE, which was really popular. It's one of my most popular videos on my YouTube channel, which is awesome. So now we're going to spend some time talking about SDM roles. For all of you out there, Vivek is a senior software leader. He worked for over 10 years in both Amazon and Facebook, currently at Facebook. So you will not get anybody more expert in this space than Vivek, and he was also a bar raiser. You're a bar raiser at Amazon, right?
Yes, I was. Yeah,
Awesome.
it's been a couple of years though, but
Oh,
ex-bar racer.
it doesn't change all that much, let's be honest, and I guess that's the whole point. But an ex-bar raiser at Amazon, so we're talking to the best person we could possibly talk to when it comes to understanding the SDM interview process at Amazon. So let's just kind of kick off with Beck. So before we talk about kind of how to be an engineering manager, and I've got some notes here as well, because you see my eyes going up and down. Before we talk about how to be an engineering manager, can we kind of talk a little bit about what is an engineering manager and what's an SDM?
Good. I think an interesting question because like when I'm looking at companies as they evolve, they usually start off with like the engineers are important because they are the ones who build things, right? They're the ones who do the work. They are the ones who are producing all the items and whatnot. And why do you need someone who manages the engineer? And that's like the next step of that. So an engineering manager or SDM, they are used interchangeably. Typically refers to someone who is managing. He's like a frontline manager for the engineers, it's a direct supervisor, and SDM, which is what Amazon uses as a terminology, is essentially a software development manager. Specifically refers to a manager of software engineers, not necessarily all engineers, because you may have hardware development, you may have people who are into firmware, operating systems. There's a bunch of other roles that are there where the roles could be a little blended. But very often, the engineering manager role is not just managing or supervising frontline engineers. It actually includes a bunch of other responsibilities. I mean, you would own the entire delivery of your product, like end to end. So you're looking at what does it take to get this thing out there. You could be the one who's writing the copy material. You could be the one who is testing the product to make sure it's working, and you could be managing a testing team, interacting with vendors. I mean, there's a bunch of different things that an engineering manager does. The job definition is actually somewhat poorly defined. I mean, it's like do everything to get the job done is pretty much what it looks like, which is actually a definition for an engineer as well. If you look at it from a startup perspective, I mean, it's not an engineer does not just write code. I mean, they do everything, including writing code. So an engineering manager is essentially taking off all of those responsibilities away from the engineers so that the engineers can focus on what they do best.
Got it. Okay. So specifically, we're going to be talking about the SDM part of that, so kind of slightly more specific and honed in. So maybe you could just talk me through what are the pathways to becoming an SDM? Is it just the next thing that a software development engineer does? And do you have to have been a software development engineer to be a software development manager?
I think that's a very it's a very common question in terms of like people ask about like how do I become an engineer, an engineering manager or an SDM, and what is a typical path or profile of people who become engineering managers. So in general, the couple of things I want to like touch upon, like being an engineering manager is essentially just one stop in your career journey. You were something before you were an engineering manager, you become an engineering manager, and you will probably become something else after you're an engineering manager. So this is more of an intermediate step. And you may spend a significant amount of time as an engineering manager. Like for me, I've been here in this engineering manager stage for over 10 years now, like 11 and a half years at this point of time. And most common path that I have seen is essentially you start out as an engineer, fresh out of school, and then you spend a couple of years, usually between 5 years, 6 years or so, and then you manage, like SDMs tend to manage engineers, so you know what to expect. So it's a very logical transition. If you have been an engineer before, you can just become that, and you have your engineering skills with you, and then you can just add on the management skills, and you can manage by experience, and then you can learn other skills as you go. So that's a very common way of doing it. Another way of actually doing this would be to transition from being like a program manager, because one of the essential duties of an engineering manager is to execute and deliver on projects. And you are essentially coordinating between multiple engineers and figuring out how to get stuff done. And you say, hey, you do this, and then after you're done with this person will do that, and then after that, we'll all to get together and then test things out and try things out and whatnot. And that aspect of it is something that a program manager does fairly well. So people who are program managers have that quality already there, and then they can obviously acquire the other skills required to be an engineering manager. And essentially, you need one strength that you can bank on and use that as your shoe in to the role,
Yeah.
whatever that role is, and then exploit that skill while you're exploring and augmenting your other skills. So that's essentially the path. These are like the two common pathways. I mean, I have seen people transition from a product manager, fairly rare. I have seen people transition to an engineering manager from being other managers. Like, I've seen QA managers, for example, transition to development managers, because you have been a QA manager, which means you know how to manage quality assurance engineers. You have probably done some kind of development oversight and things like that. So it makes sense for you to transition over and actually manage the product development. So engineering management does not have a single path to get there, but that's just like multiple ways to get there.
Okay, so you also mentioned that obviously there's life after being a software development manager. So in your experience, where do they go? What's the next step once they've done their tenure there and they want to move their career on? Where do they tend to go next?
It depends for people. I have actually seen in many cases people actually enjoy the frontline manager role significantly, quite a lot, and then they do that and they're like, you know what, I'm done. And I've seen enough frontline managers actually retire as frontline managers. They're done with their career, and that's actually fun, because it could be just it, because there's a lot of joy and pleasure when you're delivering products and when you're actually coordinating all of these things. So you could just retire as that. I mean, it's almost like being a captain of a team or something like that. So it's a good place to retire from. More often than not, people actually go a little further than a frontline engineering manager. When you start out, you just manage a handful of people, like 4 or 5 or something like that, and that's almost like a junior engineering manager. Even if you're, as I talked about, product manager, program manager to engineering manager transition, the complexity is kept low. You start with like 4 or 5 first, then you actually grow in scale and scope. So you would end up managing an entire functional area. Like, you would have a greater degree of control over different job functions. You probably will now start owning the other parts I talked about, like maybe QA, maybe delivery, maybe a whole bunch of other things. At Amazon, a typical, an average engineering manager would essentially be what's called a two pizza team. If you've heard the term, you can relate to that. Yeah, it is essentially, it's about 6 to 10 people. I mean, at least the belief is that that's like a good organizational size. Any more than 10, the noise and the chatter becomes too much for you to manage. So keeping your team size smaller is actually good. And a manager essentially tends to be the two pizza team leader. And it could be cross-functional in a sense. It's just not engineering, but it could be engineering, QA, program management, and a bunch of other disciplines that go with it. So that's like a typical role. And this role is what I have seen people execute for like even decades, and then decide to say, you know what, I'm done with it, because this is a fun role and this is like a holistic role. You end up, adding value after value after value, and it's actually a lot of fun. The next logical step from this is essentially you become a manager of managers, where just like how you became an engineer to a manager of managers essentially is just enabling and supporting a group of two pizza team leaders. And now you are actually owning a logical functional area, in the sense that you could be owning, pick any product, like, if you think about Amazon devices, then you would see like, I own the storefront for the Alexa devices, or I own this particular module of this particular thing. So it's usually a very particular functional area. Usually that functional area involves like a lot of sub-functions, where each of the sub-functions do require, as a two pizza team, to execute on their own. So that's like the manager of managers. And usually after being a manager of managers, more commonly you end up going into to becoming a director, a VP, and whatnot at Amazon. And by the way, like the two pizza team that I talked about typically is equivalent of a director role in many of the smaller companies. So if you look at the non-Amazon companies, so we typically see people who have like a director or a VP title in those companies. They come in at Amazon as a two pizza team leader very often, even though they would be managing like 50 people or 100 people or something. They would come over to Amazon and start managing a team of 10, which is cross-functional, and they find that role quite a handful, despite the fact that they have managed larger, charter within like quotes. But it's just that the role itself is actually much more intensive and much more involved, because it does involve like communication with upper management and also managing the team and managing external dependencies. So it's quite a handful.
Yeah, as a principal, actually, I find that's been generally true. You've done the bar raising piece as well, so have I. So we've seen people across all sorts of different job functions, and I can comfortably broadly say at Amazon, people tend to come into Amazon at least job title kind of perspective at a lower level than they exited their last business in. So a director would come in as a head of, a VP would come in as a director, because generally roles in Amazon are just a much larger scope than you would find equivalent role in other organizations. So clearly that's true of the SDE side of things. I would also say it's the same actually even on the non-tech side of things. That's equally true. Cool. Okay, so I'll tell you what, why don't we get into the meat of SDM interviewing? Because this is obviously what everybody is on tenterhooks to hear about. So can we start with kind of the way an interview would typically or quite often start with that question of, why do you want this role? So if I'm an SDM and I'm rocking up at Facebook or Amazon, take your pick, you can choose whichever you prefer, and someone's asking me, why do I want this role as an SDM? Why would somebody want a role as an SDM? Maybe give them some tips on how best to answer that question if they're faced with it.
Absolutely. I think let me break it down into two different small components to it. Like one is essentially, why do you want to work for Amazon, or why do you want to work for Facebook? I mean, it's that essentially, why do you want to work here as opposed to like thousands of companies that are there where you might actually probably work on equivalent size items, scope, and whatnot. Like, what's so special about this one? So that's like, it's a generic answer. It's not really SDM specific. And then let's also then jump into the SDM element of it. So yeah, the reason why I chose Amazon, why I'm working at Facebook, and if I ever were to switch, I'll probably work for one of these kinds of companies, is because I think the blast radius is actually much bigger. Like, I'm working on projects and building products that are used by millions of users. Like I start with those 6 zeros in the beginning almost always. Whereas if you're working in a smaller company, what you see is that you start with 2 zeros or 3 zeros, like it's 100 users, 1,000 users or whatnot, and then you're scaling them 10x and 100x. So if the acceleration is important to you, then you may want to work in a smaller company because you're making meaningful connections and making it bigger. Whereas if you want to impact a larger population, you want to work on products that actually have greater impact, then I think working in bigger companies, specifically Amazon or Facebook, would actually be helpful. So that's how I think about it, and that's why I'm here. Like, I used to work in a consulting company before Amazon, and my impact was actually fairly minimal. I'm sure it was great. They were paying us millions of dollars for it. So yes, from a value perspective, yeah, of course, right? I mean, it makes sense, but from an impact and output perspective, I just didn't feel that it was that that impactful, at least. And as a manager of the Kindle bookstore, I felt how the product I built, like if I add a button on the screen, I know that there's millions of people clicking on it pretty much on a daily basis even. So that actually is very powerful driver for me. So that's why I chose Amazon back when I chose Amazon. Now let's talk about SDM in particular. SDM it's a weird beast as such. I mean, the answer depends on what you're trying to get to. If you are already a people manager and you're already playing an equivalent role elsewhere, then then the question is not like, why do you want to be an SDM at Amazon, is an easier question to answer, because like I know how to be an engineering manager, I know how to lead people, I know how to deliver projects. I am actually wanting to do that at Amazon, and essentially I want to do that at scale. So and that's an easier answer. But if your question is about why do you want to be an SDM in the first place, like what motivates you to be a people manager or to lead a team, I think I would maybe think of it as there's two factors to it. One is usually that the intrinsic motivations is what I want to focus on. Why do you want to become a manager? Like if you ask me the question of saying like, so you've been a manager for 10 years, like, why did you become a manager? What prompted the change, right? Is that so I think the way a couple of things happened, and it was pretty organic shift for me when I became a manager. And the way it happened was that like I'm more of a people's person, in case you couldn't tell. I spend a lot of time chatting with people. I enjoy learning other people's journeys, discoveries, and so back when I joined Amazon, I joined as an engineer. And one of the things I did was I would actually spend most of my day chatting with everybody else in the team, understanding what they were doing, and learning how they were thinking about their problems. And I would spend time enabling them to be better. And that was my my first half of the day, or like almost first 3 quarters of the day. And the last quarter of the day was actually do my stuff, and I would just do that. I'd probably work. I actually think I was just working 2 hours a day on stuff that my manager thinks I should be working on, like just coding, whatever. Right, that piece of it was not that difficult, and it just took, yeah, I need to do this, I need to build this thing, I need to add this code and whatnot. And yeah, every now and then it becomes a little like I bite off more than I can chew. I miscalculate something, I end up working a weekend or something. But more often than not, my like almost 3 quarters was just helping others, and a quarter was just that. So it logically where it came to was it did two things. One was the overall team's productivity went up, and my manager was able to notice that. Like something happened when they added me to the team. Overall, the team's engagement levels were high, the team's motivation was high, and all of that. So my manager's like, and with a little bit of digging, they figured out why that was happening as well. And then that essentially caused them to say, hey, I think it's probably time to think of you as, have you thought of people management as a career? Do you want to do this full time? I'm like, you mean I can do this full time and not have to do the other 25% that I'm doing? So yes, that's how it worked. And then I just jumped into that. So the part of it that actually motivated me was actually around the ability to help and deliver greater value across the team by just like pushing and nudging. And the thing that was actually interesting was that, so I joined the team new, which means that I did not have any domain knowledge. So the way it was like, this is like I am asking them questions, and I'm just framing questions and asking them questions to learn how to do this. And like, hey, what about this? Like, why are you doing it this way? In the past I've seen it done in a different way, or should we not try that, and things like that. So it's always things which are not, I'm not coming from a position of knowledge or like subject matter expertise. I'm actually just coming from a position of like asking the questions and whatnot. And that's like one of the elements. And that we could probably do that when we say maybe the opposite question of saying like, what are bad reasons to be a manager? Is probably a lot.
Seeing as you asked, yeah, go on. Seeing as you mentioned it, why wouldn't you want to be an SDM?
We will get there. So the part that is there is that like one thing I want to make like people understand is that invariably people that you hire, they have to be smarter than you, more efficient than you, and more effective than you, because otherwise it's not worth it. I mean, the whole point of you being a like I go back to the captain of a sports team analogy, is that if you're the captain, doesn't mean that you're the best player. You just need to, you just know how to use all the best players. You need to have an amazing goalkeeper, you need to have amazing forward, whatever, like different positions that you have in whatever game that is, be it cricket, football, or soccer, or whatnot, right? So you need to have the best players in all of those positions, and they will probably be better than anybody else in that particular role or position. And your job is to essentially coordinate them and then make them work with each other and minimize confusion and make sure the whole thing moves forward. So that's the role which actually makes it interesting. Now, the reasons of like just digging into why not to become a manager, and that's where I come to. There are like extrinsic factors or extrinsic motivations. Very common reasons that I've heard people talk about, saying, "Hey, I want to be a manager because I see everybody else transition from an engineer to a manager." I think that's a terrible reason. I mean, you should, if you think it's right for you, because what's right for somebody else or what's right for the majority of the population may not be right for you. I mean, it's logical, but it's probably not. The second thing I've seen is essentially there is a glass ceiling. If I'm an engineer, I can't grow further. If I have to become much bigger, and if I have to become more, transferable in certain ways. As an engineer, if I'm a 50-year-old engineer, for example, if I have to find another job, it's going to be impossible for me. But if I'm a 50-year-old manager, I think I can actually take my skills and transfer and whatnot. It might make sense. There's a little bit of truth to the transferability of management skills because you're talking about project management, people management. The role itself is a little more dynamic. So, of course, it's a lot more transferable than like an engineer, because as an engineer, you have your bigger deal is the domain expertise and your understanding of the code, your understanding of the software components and technologies. So there is some element of lock in there as an engineer. So there is more flexibility as a manager to move, but I don't think that would I don't think that's a good enough reason for you to be a manager, because I mean it's a longer career. So plan your career as a bigger journey. See how SDM actually helps you in that one. If you're looking for flexibility, a program manager is probably amazingly flexible. That's probably the best of all, because you can just the tools that you use are actually reasonably limited, but you need to be super smart using them in certain ways, and you can build a lot of experience with that, and you can be an amazing like technical program manager or a non-technical program manager. It doesn't matter. I mean, both roles are actually fantastically dynamic. So a lot of bad reasons why you want to become a manager. One is essentially I want to be flexible. I want to be dynamic. I want to keep my job opportunities open. I mean, yes, but may not be the best. The other activity that I think is bad is about I want to stop being told what to do, and I want to tell people what to do. Something like that. I mean, somebody just said that exactly verbatim to me like a couple of weeks ago.
I was a manager for decades, and I've always had someone tell me what to do. It's like, unless you're Jeff, and even then, it's not Jeff anymore, is it? It's Andy now, isn't it? Like, well, go on.
Somebody tells you what to do anyways, whether it's the shareholders, I mean, or something. I mean, it's always like external factors that actually influence you. So, yeah. So I don't think it's that. I mean, it's like if you are motivated by the fact that you're looking at someone who's telling you what to do, then and then you say, hey, that role looks nice because they get to sit around and do nothing and just tell others to do whatever. You would be in for a shock once you transition, because you don't really see the whole parts of the part of the iceberg that you're not seeing is essentially a much larger portion. So that is that. So that's kind of in my mind, that's like the extrinsic factors that you may want to be very careful about.
Definitely plenty there for people to think about if they're thinking about transitioning from the SDE to the SDM side of things. Now, you have mentioned to me before, because we've been chatting for a while and we know each other quite well at this point, you mentioned that you have another one of these magic frameworks that are kind of Vivek's magic kind of constructs around the SDM role. I think you were telling me it's something called the 3 Ps and the 3 Cs, something like that. So do you want to share that with everybody else? Because I liked that when you explained it to me last time.
Yes. So I love it. Just like full disclaimer, I don't think it's my framework. It's how I rationalize things, but I don't think I came up with it. I must have read it somewhere. Unfortunately, I don't know the source. So if someone actually knows the source, like maybe comment somewhere, and then I would know. I mean, there's a wide enough audience here that I can actually hear that. The fun thing is that whenever I've actually explained this over the last couple of years, people have actually come back and say, that's a fantastic way of looking at this, and I've never heard this before. So I don't think it's that popular, or it's not that common.
Not popular yet. It will be once this goes on my channel, obviously. The world will know about it at large. But go on, tell us about it. 3 Ps, 3 Cs.
So the way the framework works is essentially it's the 3 Ps and 3 Cs of people management, or of being an engineering manager or a software development manager. So the first 3 Ps are, the first P is people. Since you're a people manager, as an engineering manager or a software development manager, you manage people. So how you manage people and whatnot is important. We can actually dig into each one of those in a little bit. The second P is the product management. Like, you are the product owner for what you do. And then, I mean, you will have a product manager helping you, but you still are supposed to understand your customers, understand the value that your system is bringing and things like that. And then the third P essentially also breaks out further into more around like it's the program side of the story. So it's actually the project management, the process of how you get things done. It's more the delivery side of the story, the execution side of the story. And so that's the three P's: people, product, and project. And then the fourth, fifth, and sixth elements, the three C's, are essentially all communication. And it is upward communication, which is around how you talk to your upstream, your bosses, your stakeholders, VPs, and things like that. The second communication is more the opposite of that, which is sort of downward communication. How do you talk to your team? People are looking up to you for organizational context. They're looking at you to help you stabilize the ship, like in uncertain terms, where when things are going on, when there's a bad press cycle or something that happens, or suddenly there is like the pandemic happened, like, nobody has a clue. How do we work? As a manager, you are expected to manage the communication, let people know. This is like, almost like, calm the whole thing, saying, hey, everything is going to be okay. We're fine. You have no freaking clue, but everything is going to be okay. Right? So be the steady ship there. And of course, you should be able to work, contextualize that and take that upstream as well, and make sure that you're vocalizing your team's needs and demands to the execs so that they can help decide. The third part of it is actually the interesting bit, which is around communicating sideways, which is working with your peers in the two pizza model, working with other two pizza teams, and aligning drivers and making sure that you can get things done collaboratively. So that's essentially the three P's and the three C's. And as I can talk more about it maybe when we talk about the interview process and things like that, because I think essentially this is what you need to be good at. And what does an interview do? Figure out, are you good at all of these things?
Okay, well, let's do that then. Let's just go into what can I expect if I'm walking into an SDM interview obviously this is about Amazon because I'm the Amazon interview whiz, but I expect it wouldn't be too different in any big tech organization. What can I expect from that actual SDM interview process? What would you be looking to cover if you were the interviewer?
Absolutely. So let me actually talk about it from Amazon's perspective, because different companies do the same thing, but in different ways. Like in the sense that Amazon specifically, you do actually have behavioral interviewing as a part of every round. Even though they're focusing on specific competencies, they are actually talking about leadership principles and trying to understand and extract information about that. Whereas I think Facebook actually has a specific round which is meant for behavioral, and that's what they focus on. And then they focus on different skills in each of the other interviews, and they keep it isolated. I mean, there's nothing wrong with one versus the other, but I think the Amazon style is just that since every interview focuses on that aspect of it is a lot more relevant, in the sense you need to know your stories, your star, and everything else. So all the other pieces that we talk about for Amazon interview and what's important is absolutely, it continues to be relevant for an engineering manager. So let me just focus a little bit on the content of what gets covered in those interviews, and how to actually address and answer those questions. I think there's enough material on your channel. I've watched a lot of those videos where you talk about how to answer this and how not to answer this. I think all of those rules and guidelines apply as is. And so what I'm just talking about is what areas to specifically focus on.
Perfect.
So let's talk about. So I talked about the three P's and the three C's, right? So that's exactly what we are, what the interviewers are looking for, and essentially looking for: are you good at the three P's, and are you good at the three C's, and can you come in and deliver on those three P's and three C's as a part of the team? And that's primarily it. On top of that, they may add a little bit of things like, do you have the domain skills? If I'm trying to hire you as an engineering manager on the Alexa voice team, then do you understand, like, how does that domain work? How does the technology work? That's like one small piece of it. But in many cases, managers are expected to have minimal domain knowledge and transition over. So let's jump back into the specifics here, right? So let's go in the same order that we just talked about. The first one is people management. And the goal of the people management interview is to figure out how you're dealing with engineers in general. We expect you to be essentially a magnet for talent, in the sense that you should be attracting talent into your team. People should be speaking highly of you. You are regarded as someone who understands how to identify talent. You understand how to nurture talent. You know when to actually cut your losses, understand low performers, and then be able to to put them in situations where they'll do better, or if things don't work out, then you may have to figure out a way to terminate. And you would often find questions in the interview, which is talking about how do you motivate high performers in your team? How do you motivate low performers in your team? And how would you deal with low performers in the team?
So if I'm a SDM, I can fully expect someone's going to ask me something about hire and develop the best.
Hire and develop the best is exactly the LP. Thank you. Yeah, that is the primary leadership principle. But again, hire and develop the best. I just want to make sure that people who are listening to this are not thinking, hey, hire and develop the best is only for engineering management. Is not true. Hire and develop the best is expected from everyone. Yeah. More so from, like, if you're weak in hire and develop the best, it could be a coachable skill for an engineer, but it's like a mandatory, must have good skills for a manager. So you may not be hired if you don't have hire and develop the best as a skill for you. The part that I wanted to chat about was, like, I think one of the, this was an interesting part. I'll digress a little bit here and I'll come back to the main topic as well, is that somebody was asking, saying, how much time would you spend with your engineers? Like, your top performers, your middle of the pack, and then your bottom performer. How much time would you perform? How much time would you spend? So if you're I think maybe capitalist of sorts, then you would spend more time with the top performers because the return on investment is, like, significantly high. You spend a few hours with the top performers, like, they will actually go and amplify that benefit and you're good to go. If you are more on the socialist side of the spectrum, you're like, I want everything to be equitable. I want to spend as much time and make sure that I give everybody equal opportunities to perform and do better. And then I want to make sure that it's the person who is not doing well is the one who needs more help. And if I invest my time with them, then they will grow better. And across the team, I'm raising the overall average of the team. My top performers are self-driven. I don't have to do anything there. Is one school of thought. And the reality is somewhere in between, like always. And every manager draws the line in a different place. And we are looking at what that thing looks like. At the end of the day, I think the rubric or the framework that's good to keep is essentially, your goal is to maximize the total throughput of the team, in total. And however you do it is fine. So if you are actually doing that by focusing on your top performers and they do well, and you're not focusing on your on the let's say you have a team of 10, your top 2 performers, you're focusing on them. The remaining 8, you don't focus much on them. They may not be as motivated. They may leave and whatnot. But if you're getting enough value out of the top 2, maybe that's the right answer. But more likely than not, it's not the case. And if you focus on everyone and in a proportionate way so that everybody is doing better, maybe that's a better answer. So I think the thing I'd like to like everybody, specifically engineering managers, to think about is actually reflect on your career. Think about what kind of a manager you are, and think about how you're actually focusing on this, and see if you want to change your focus. And think as this is an outcome-driven exercise, right? So you want to find out if you're actually are you being efficient? This is a process, and you have to look at what you're doing, see if there are any tweaks you can make, and objectively measure the throughput and see how that goes. What I have found is people who are on the more on the, as I say, socialistic side within quotes, tend to actually have a much wider team base. Like, there's not enough attrition, not enough churn in those teams, and they tend to perform better overall because there is a sense of security there. There's a lot of feeling of I think I'm being taken care of, and there's a lot of motivation that comes in. If you're only focusing on a handful of individuals, the other people may feel neglected. They may choose to leave, or they may choose to go to teams where they would be the top bosses and be prioritized that way. So it's a very, very manager specific trait. Organizations do impose and enforce some kind of culture that different organizations focus, different companies like Facebook, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, they all have their own styles that are there. And the leadership principles guide Amazon engineers in terms of these are the things that you need to be good at. But there is a lot of individuality that a manager can bring in. There's a lot of personality that a manager can bring in into their teams, and that makes a huge difference. So people management is fundamental, and that gets tested in the interviews. And more than your actual style, if you're being very deliberate and methodical about why I am doing what I'm doing, and you have a good answer around that, that will help. So the reason why I'm asking you, as in your audience, TG, to reflect on this is to to make sure that you have an answer ready when they're saying, why are you doing it? Like, why are you spending more time with this? Or what kind of things will you focus on? You have a structured answer about, here's how I do it, here's how I measure it, and whatnot. One question I want to just jump in and ask is, like, how do you deal with low performers? Is a very common question that gets asked. And the temptation there actually is to easily typecast people and say, hey, that's like, I had a low performer who had no skills, no whatever, no motivation, no desire to work, just happened to be on my team, and I just found a way to, I tried working with them, didn't work, so I let them go, or something like that. This is like a very simple narrative, and it kind of works, but that's not good enough for Amazon interviews, because you would know, people would ask about, like, so tell me more. I mean, how do they, like, you are, in addition to the behavior, the performance, you need to talk about two things that is important. One is you need to talk about the person itself, like what's that person, like, put yourself in their shoes and think about, if I'm not good at a particular skill, what kind of inputs do I need so that I know that I'm not good at it, and then I am actually making steps to do better, and am I getting the right kind of inputs? Like, if you simply just tell them that, hey, you're not, like, you're not good enough and you're out, doesn't really help. Like, you need to be defining what good enough means. You need to show what that path to good looks like, and you need to set expectations in terms of, this is how you're being measured, and you need to have an independent metric of measure. It's not just you or the other engineer, like, just measuring each other, but you're actually having a mechanism that's unbiased, that's actually in place. Now, having this framework set up clearly is something that is important. Like, Amazon has these things intrinsically built in to the review process that we have every year, and so on. And then there's, like, people reviews that happen, one-on-ones and coaching conversations. The PIP program that is actually fairly, talked about in a very negative light, is performance improvement plan, but it's actually talked about as if it's like it's a mechanism to fire people, whereas actually a mechanism to grow folks, right? So, I mean, there's a lot of factors that people may actually not appreciate the nuances that come with it. But again, if you're a manager who doesn't understand the PIP process at all, and you're just using it more as a tool to document bad behavior and get and terminate people, then that's actually not the right way of looking at it. And that gets tested in the interviews, and that's one of the reasons. So that's sort of the people management bit of it. I mean, you could probably run an hour or two just on people management, or even longer. This is your intrinsic, like, skill that you have developed over the ages of working with people, and you're dealing with different types of people, different classes of people, folks who are actually, motivated intrinsically, extrinsically, people who are quiet, people who are loud, people who, require encouragement publicly, require encouragement privately, and things like that. So there's a lot of factors that go into it. People management, I think, is one of the key differentiating factors. If you're not good at this, or this is something that makes you uncomfortable, this role is probably not for you. There are enough roles which have other aspects of it, but this is just people management. So any questions or follow-ups on that?
No, I'm going to summarize it up as, it sounds like, unsurprisingly, with the word M at the end of the role, you've got to be prepared to have some really good examples that speak to hire and develop the best, albeit we know that other people who aren't managers have to talk about that from a peer level, but nonetheless, from a manager's point of view, I need examples of hire and develop the best. And the other thing that you covered off, which I just released a video on the other day, actually, was the difference between the what I did and the how I did it. So you just gave us some really nice detail about the different elements of how that you would want to be able to bring to the interview to answer any questions around hire and develop there. So I think you've given a really nice roadmap to anybody to go back and look at their examples for management / hire and develop the best, and review whether they hit those different marks. So we've talked about the people piece. You mentioned that you're a product owner, your other P.
Yeah,
so
let's
tell me more about
that. Let's dig into the number P, second P in the list, right? So that's the product ownership, and product ownership essentially means that you are always looking for. Again, this is important from an Amazon perspective, because your customer obsession is the leadership principle that usually comes in here. You're talking about what is the right thing for the customer, and you're not building anything that a customer will not be using. So a common metric that you have is, whenever somebody is talking about a feature, you'd always talk about, like, who's waiting for this feature, whom are we building this feature for, and then you talk about like what is the return that I can expect from this investment, and you're actually being very frugal about your choice of and of where you choose to deploy your resources, because you want to make sure that you're maximizing the total value that your team is building. So that's where the product management comes in. You will have a product manager who's going to be supporting your area, your functional area, maybe directly, maybe indirectly. But the more product sense that you have, the better it is. And the way they test this in the interviews is actually they'll talk about what kind of decisions have you taken, and what was your proudest accomplishment, and tell me what was so nice about it. And what they're looking for is specifically you talking about the numbers, the reasons why you were following on certain things, and why you chose one versus the other, like what decision points or trade-offs that you were encountering. And this is not trade-offs in terms of execution, but it's trade-offs in terms of product features, in terms of what features, what to build, and what to deliver. It's not about the how part of it here. It's more around the what. But then you have to obviously go into how you made the decision, because Amazon interviews are always looking for the how and the what, right? In addition to the what, they are always looking at the what decides, what decision framework did you use, and they're looking for the repeatability of that particular mechanism. It's not like you randomly decided to do A versus B and it just happened to be lucky. The chances of you replicating that will be fairly minimal. So that's the product management piece of it, or the product ownership piece of it. This interview is primarily focused on, again, it focuses on relationship with other product managers. It talks about how are you challenging and contributing to the other product managers in the organization. And it also talks about how are you making sure that you're communicating the product context to your engineers, and you're delivering, your engineers are fully aware of what the customer connection looks like. Why are we building it? Whom are we building it for? What are the key problem statements that we are trying to attack? So that's like the quick version of what the product interview looks like. This one is not a very big focus area, relatively speaking, compared to the people. People is like, a huge weight goes to the people side of the story, less so on the product, because Amazon actually has a fairly good amount of, external product. Like they have product managers outside the team. So you're almost always tag teaming with product managers. And very rarely will you be left out in a particular thing, especially when you're starting a brand new area. You may have to do it yourself entirely, but otherwise you have huge support here. So here focus is, can you work with product managers to get stuff done?
So are we talking, if we were to turn this back into the language of Amazon, because obviously everyone watching this video is thinking Amazon, just going over the ground that you've covered, are we talking about leadership principles like trust and bias for action and deliver results, because you were talking about metrics and focusing on the metric data points? If I cover the right ones, is there anything else that from a
customer obsession? I would actually,
yes,
and customer obsession, think big are the ones that I would add here. I would take the bias for action and I'd probably move it to the project management, because bias for action tends to be more execution oriented. And deliver results, of course, is like, it's intrinsic in all of these. You're looking at results. And surprisingly enough, I would add frugality here. If
you mentioned frugality, you dropped that word in. Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Okay. So we've got a nice few bunch of leadership principles for people to be thinking about. So let's move on to the project management piece then. What does that look like from the interview, and maybe what of those leadership principles should I be expecting to make sure I include?
So project management is essentially, once you've decided what you're building, now the rubber hits the road. You're trying to figure out how to deliver the product. You're trying to sequence things, understand dependencies, and end up executing, sequencing the launch, slowly dialing it up and rolling it further. And two parts of the equation here. One is like, project management, as in how will you make sure that your pieces are done, and there is a wider program management where how does that fit with other things that other teams are building? If there are dependencies, some of the teams actually wanting you to do certain things for them, then when do you deliver them? Are you delivering them on time? And how are you maintaining and managing the communication between the teams to make sure that the product, like everything gets delivered? I mean, this is much like any other engineering activity, whether it's like a construction activity or whatnot. Software engineering is engineering in that same sense, because you have different pieces, people are working on it differently, and there's requirements, specifications, and expectations and whatnot, and you need to manage that. So the piece that's important here is that very often you will not have a program manager who is supporting you. because when you start a team of engineers, it'll start with like a product manager, an engineering manager, and a bunch of engineers, and that's about it. It usually doesn't have a program manager that quickly. Only after the complexity becomes a little more, you outsource your program management functions to the expert, who would be like someone, a TPM or a PM that you will hire, a PM as in program manager that you will hire for that reason. And so there is a minimum expectation that you will be able to handle moderate complexity projects. Like you should be able to deal with ambiguity. You should be able to understand. Like you should be able to execute projects without actually understanding the technical aspects of it as much. Because in some cases, you do not have the capability to dive into the technical elements of all your peer teams, for example. So you need to have the proper project management frameworks in place. You need to understand, drop in a few words here if you like to understand how risk analysis works, figure out what the objective risk is, like risk mitigation strategies. The other one is essentially, it's often called as the CPM, which is the critical path method, where you're trying to figure out if this is my project execution plan, what is in the critical path, so that I want to make sure that I want to de-risk that first. I mean, if there are modules which are if there is enough slack in them, like if I start them today, but if I start them a week later, it's okay, then that's fine. You don't have to worry about it too much. But then there are a few things where there is a dependency that's waiting for it. A day slip in this particular activity will delay the end date by a day. Then you want to focus on that more strongly and things like that. A lot of the project managers that I know actually are they understand this intrinsically, and they do very well with that. Most of the engineering managers that I know, software development managers that I know, they have broad awareness of this. They are able to intuitively apply these principles. They may not be able to name them. They may not be able to explain why they did what they did, but they'll apply that in their execution. So in the interview, at the interview table, your interviewer will be probing you on, so how did you dynamically solve a problem? Like give me a last minute blocker that you resolved, or tell me, like, your VP comes and says the website is slow. How do you deal with it? And you're talking about, like, how do you decompile a problem into, it's like, take it step by step, keep the calm, and then carry on, figure out, like, take the steps out one at a time, engage the right set of people, and get them to deliver, get them to debug that particular piece for you. So that broad expectation is what we have from a project management experience.
Okay, great. So we've kind of gone through all of the behavioral stuff. What about competencies? Because I remember when we talked about the SDE part of things, and we talked about the coding element, we talked about solution design element. Can I, or our viewers here who are going for SDM roles, can they expect anything kind of technical in their interview experience at Amazon?
Yes, so that was actually whenever I've talked about this 3P 3C framework, one of the complaints that I've had is like, hey, what about like competency, core design skills, core technical skills, system design, engineering, and coding? Like, am I not supposed to have any of those or something? To a large extent, I'm kind of assuming you have that, but let me actually touch upon a few of these things. Again, different companies have different bars. Specifically at Amazon, I don't think, back at least when still I was there, and I don't think it's true. I think it's still true now. They don't really expect coding as a skill or a competency from an engineering manager. Like, you don't really code for your day job. Like, I mean, you're not writing code. You're typically not reviewing code per se, but you should have enough familiarity and enough intuition about what is possible and what is not possible from a coding perspective. So having that tech sense is important, but not necessarily the ability to write lines of code. But other companies, like, I know I've seen Google and Facebook, and I don't know if Microsoft does that or not, but there are a few companies where they expect coding from the manager. They deprioritize it, but they expect you to say, yeah, you know what, you should be handy. You should know how to write a few lines of code and things like that. And to be honest, that skill is very underrated. Like, you should know how to write a SQL query, for example, to pull the data for some analysis that you're doing, because then you're not like dependent on your engineers for everything. And so that's that. And then you should be able to open up a piece of module or a functionality. And if a customer is facing an issue, you should have the intuition to go to the right file, read through the code, and say, oh, yeah, that's exactly why this error is happening. And then you can just point your engineers to that, and they can go do the fix. I mean, you don't have to fix it, but you should have enough technical depth to do that. So I would recommend coding as a skill. And again, if you're interviewing for Amazon as an SDM, you probably have all the skills and your preparation is roughly the same. So you might as well hit other companies as well, and it might just make sense for you. May not be as effective for Amazon. If your Amazon is a target company, then spending too much time on coding is not effective. But if you're looking at other companies as well, you might want to spend a little bit of time, just like and I would recommend lead code easy style questions for it. And you can listen to the engineering part of the talk that we had last time, where we talked about specifics and how to prepare and what to think about. So that will be the coding element of it. The second part, which is absolutely important for managers, is actually around system design. And the difference between a system design for an engineer versus a system design for manager, and this is something that gets very confusing for many folks. And I've seen managers actually prepare for system design like an engineer, which is fine.
Okay.
It's good, but that's not. I think there's a subtle difference which is important.
Right. So everybody, pay attention to this bit. If you listen to none of the rest of it, listen to this. Go.
Thank you. So the key difference here is actually around what is the role? What is your role when you're actually in your day job working and a new system comes up and says, now you're supposed to design the system. My engineer is going to be focusing on the nuts and bolts of it, the details of it, the depth and everything else. And I am actually making sure that the depth is being covered and I'm looking at the breadth of the story. So I am looking for specifically the motivations of why the system is being built. What kind of problems are we solving? Are there problems that we should be solving that are not being solved? So the typical engineering focus is actually around, give me the requirements, here's a problem, and I'm trying to solve the problem, here's how I will solve the problem, and I've made sure that the problem is solved. That's like the 4-step process that we talked about last time in the discussion. Whereas as a manager, the problem exploration is a lot more enunciated. Like we talk about, what problem are we trying to solve? Why are we solving that problem? Are we solving the real problem? And what exists already and what doesn't exist at this point? And what systems are we trying to augment? And talk a little bit more about the motivations of like, are we keeping the system flexible? Is it like, future forward facing and things like that? Those elements get highlighted a lot more. So this is for system design of a new system that is like, posed to you as a hypothetical question. And the other element of it is like, reflectively looking at, hey, tell me about a system that you've built and tell me more. The thing that they're looking at is essentially communication wise, you should be able to communicate the context of the system without actually going into the nitty-gritty, saying, we use like version 3 of this particular thing. We use these kind of signatures, and it's like a 5-line configuration file or something like that. I mean, the specifics are useful, but it's confusing the interviewer, and the interviewer doesn't know your domain, right? So you need to be able to communicate a technical design without actually going into the depth of the individual things. And you should be prepared to go to the depths when the interviewers are probing you on it. So that is the skill that you need to build. So being aware of the depths, but not going into it unless it's actually asked for or unless it's relevant to the point that you're trying to make. So if they're asking you a question about like, give me a hardest technical challenge that you faced or a bug that you discovered which was phenomenal or something, then you want to explain the overall system context without going into the depth. And then you want to like drill down to that one vertical slice all the way down to the real core bug that you're talking about. And you should be able to explain that as if you are like, almost engineer-like in that particular case. So that's the depth that is expected. So the key difference between an engineer's view of a system design and a manager's view of system design, at least this is my perspective or my opinion, is that the manager's view tends to be more around, so it's a little broader. It's a little more fill in the blanks of sorts. Like I'm expecting to know the system to a point where I can confirm that my engineer has specific elements handled, and wherever they don't have it handled, I have the capacity to drop down to that particular area and focus on that particular thing and fill in the gaps. Now, you can't do all of that in an interview, but the expectation is, again, stay at the broader level without having to dig in and then go in as necessary. Again, don't take the advice to say I stay high level always, because if you do that, you will get dinged for not being technical enough. Yeah. But if you go too down in the depth very quickly, then you will get dinged for actually thinking more like an engineer and less like a like a leader or a manager. And principal engineers are also expected to demonstrate the same behavior. Like at Amazon PE interviews, typically they do expect you to be able to define the system broadly and start talking about the whys behind the system and not just about the technical components. You should be excited about the technology, but that should not be your only primary driver.
Okay, so there are a different set of questions effectively when you are an engineering manager looking at a solutions design challenge than the set of questions you would be asking if you were the engineer looking at that challenge.
I'll differ a little bit. I mean, the questions actually sound eerily similar, unfortunately. So you'll have to, as a candidate, as an interviewer, an interviewer is going to ask you a question about, tell me more about the system or something. It'll be vague by default, right? I mean, the interview questions are typically
Sorry, I didn't mean my questions to the candidate. I mean, if I was a candidate, an SDM reflecting on a solution design that I was and giving an interviewer an answer. If I was the engineer, I'd be talking at the depth detail of the nature of the things I was asking. If I was the manager, I'd be talking about much more conceptual levels, like your point about actually, do we really have a problem here? You know, your engineer's saying, just give me the problem, whereas your SDM is saying, hold your horses for a little bit. I just want to really understand, do we really have a problem? Who are we solving for? Blah, blah, blah. We might give it a try, Vivek, if we might be able to come up with, in a support PDF or something, some of those questions that we would hope a SDM would have asked in their solution design, just to give our viewers a cue for.
I think let's actually put something together. I think I just talked about a few, like are we solving we talked about a few right now. Are we solving the right problems and what is already there? What are we trying to build? Is it the most effective thing to build right now? What is the minimum viable product? Who's going to be using this product? So those are all the questions. So essentially, there's an element of product thinking that comes into this, which is what is emphasized. While it's a technical solution that we're thinking about, but it's more product thinking. I think we can distill some of this conversation and we can extend that as well into the handout that you may want to prepare for.
That'd be awesome. We did a handout last time, again, incredibly popular. If only I could charge for it, I'd be a millionaire by now. But it's completely free. Completely free, the download that we did for the SDEs, and we'll do the same for this one. But it's really popular, so it'd be great if we could do something like that.
Awesome.
Okay, so we have covered an enormous amount of ground. So, and we're at an hour and something, I think. Barring, I'll have to cut some out because somebody rang just as Vivek and I started this conversation. So we might have to cut some stuff out. So, is there anything we've missed? Is there any other advice, Vivek, that you would give to anybody heading into a software development manager interview that we haven't yet covered?
I think I want to touch upon the commission piece, the 3 C's part of it, and how they're tested in the interviews and how you think about it. I think we missed that bit is sort of important because there's a piece of it's actually something that you have extensively covered in your other sessions as well. So we can be super brief here, but I'd love to cover it for completeness.
For sure.
I think one of the things that I recommend whenever you're interviewing with a company, whichever the company is, try and see if you can talk to a few people from that company and see how they think about it, how they talk about it, how they internalize and whatnot. Because at the interview table, when you're answering questions, the interviewers are trying to take whatever you're saying and they're mapping it to what they want to hear in terms of did they do this, did they do that? And they're mapping it to whatever their framework is. So the more you speak in their language, in their constructs, in their framework, the less mapping they have to do, the more effective the interview communication is. And that's like the number one interview tip is essentially, if you are able to communicate in a way that the interviewers don't have to translate that much, then you've already done it's high fidelity communication at that point of time. So that's super important. So if you're interviewing with Amazon, talk to a few Amazon engineers, managers, PMs, TPMs, specifically people in that role. Think about how they're thinking about it. And it's just general discussions. It's not about give me interview tips. It's actually about tell me how you do your day job. What are the challenges that you face? Learn about that and see if you can articulate your experiences in the same vocabulary. And that will actually give you a huge leg up in terms of how the interview will go. So that's one, which is it's a macro feedback for communication in general. Because you do that, you're an effective communicator. You are able to get your points across. Now, the 3 C's that we talked about again are executive communication, which is something depending on whether you've done it or not done it, that becomes a little different and difficult. You may have to prepare for it. Like how would you deliver good news to upward leadership? How do you deliver bad news? How do you deal with executing an unpopular opinion? Like, what if your project gets delayed by 3 weeks or something like that, and then your executives, like, you're ready with they're deploying, and then the exec comes and says like, nope, not deploying now, for other reasons. I mean, there could be shareholder reasons, there could be extrinsic factors like industry world or whatever, and you need to now communicate that to your team, but you can't. You have to. There's an element of disagree and commit that actually shows up here, but you need to actually, in addition to disagree and commit, the first part of it is important, which is you need to have a backbone. So the executive communication is all about representing status accurately, comprehensively, while also standing up for yourself and your team. So that part of it is the executive communication.
And we're also talking earn trust as well, just kind of the first portion that we were talking about, kind of covering earn trust and backbone, disagree and commit.
They go together. I mean, because you can always complain and push back, but respectfully disagreeing is a very, very big factor in how you do it, and that actually builds trust. And then it also builds your reputation, right? If you actually are calling shots the right way at the right time, then people actually will look up to you for validation, even and not just on things that you own, but also on other things as well. If your peer manager is bringing something, you should be able to respectfully disagree and win their trust, both as someone who's thinking about them and also thinking on their for their well-being. Now let me jump into the downward part of it. This one is more natural for many people, but the concern here is a little different. Like at Amazon, the downward communication is actually very isolated. Like at Amazon, managers have a lot of autonomy. You run your team pretty much the way you see fit. There are some checks and balances, but those checks and balances are mostly reactive and not very proactive. So if you do not communicate the context to your team, or if your team is progressively getting, they feel bad about what's going on, they are uneasy and whatnot, they may leave, or the team may actually, the team dynamics may actually get spoiled. And there may not be a whole lot of detection that may happen before things go bad, quite bad. And that becomes a challenge. So which is why at interviews and at managers, we do expect and we insist on making sure that managers are able to communicate the organizational context to the teams appropriately, extract information from the team, work with the team as individuals, extract that information and deal with it. That part of it is important. I think that's the balance, right, between how much autonomy you can give and how much can I make a rule book and say you follow all of these things. I mean, if you I compare this to if you look at any of the retail shops and whatnot, the store manager is the manager. They don't have a whole lot of control over how they deal with it. They have a rule book, a guidelines and whatnot. They just follow everything that is there and you're good to go. Typically, there is not a whole lot of individuality that you can demonstrate. And there's some latitude, but not a whole lot. Whereas here, there's a lot of autonomy. And essentially, you decide the projects you're working on. You decide when to work on it, how to work on it. There's a lot more flexibility. So communication, and especially having tight communication loop with your engineers, is very important for a manager. And that is something that has checks and balances, but not so much that it actually gates you. So that autonomy makes it important. So in the interviews, they'll specifically be looking for how do you do that, and how do you keep your team up to date. And most common bad answer here is like, oh, I'm super transparent. I'm like, no, transparency is sometimes not a good thing. You may have to. It's not, because
No, I agree. You don't need to scare people sometimes until you know there's something worth being scared about. Yeah.
There are times when I was like, if there is a 5% chance that my director could leave the company, right? Because I know something is going on. There's no point in telling my team about that right now. I mean, it's a risk. It's not a materialized risk, and you need to weigh the impact of what you say. It's like if you're just being completely transparent, sharing everything from everywhere and everything, it's going to be bad. On the opposite end of the spectrum, if you actually withhold material information that could be important for the engineer's execution, for their well-being, or for their mental sanity, then I think you're doing it wrong as well. So there's a fine line that you need to walk, and it's a very subjective call. And you are again, as I said, you need to do the keep calm and carry on bits for your engineering team, even when you don't know what it is. You could be transparent there, saying, I don't know how it's going to work, but I feel that it's going to be all right. Let's go talk about it, and let me get you the following things and whatnot. earning trust here is very important, and that is again, so earn trust, earn trust. The theme is very common across all areas, and that's the downward side of it. The last one, very briefly, this is sideways communication. This is pretty much more around aligning drivers with your peer teams, and this is sort of persuading them to do your bidding of sorts, and this is persuasion without power. You don't have any control over them. You don't control them. You don't own any parts of it. You can't dictate terms and things like that. You have to collaboratively work with them, and you can do anything here that you can be super creative as well. A couple of things are like, you can do something that's important for them, and they will do something that's important for you. A quid pro quo generally works very well in team priorities. In some cases, escalation works. At Amazon, escalation is pretty good in the sense that if my priorities are subtly different from my peer team's priorities, I can take it up to a common chain, like a director or a VP or wherever that the chain terminates, and I could say, what do you think is more important? And then we align, and then there's like a disagree and commit, and then we just go do that. That's actually fantastic. Facebook, that doesn't work, because Facebook actually does not have the lines of command are fairly disconnected and by design. And so there's a lot more emphasis on collaboration. You need to collaborate and figure out what's important, as opposed to expecting like someone up top to give you like a final, like, a directional guidance of what needs to happen. So communication sideways is important for Amazon because you need to keep them posted, manage dependencies. It's more operational. Communication sideways is more important for Facebook and even Google, if I recall correctly, is because there it's actually for even like, setting up the product itself. Like you're doing, it's more strategic at that point of time. The sideways communication is relevant from a strategy perspective, not just from not just from an execution and tactics perspective. So with that, I think comprehensively covers all aspects of it. Again, we can go on for hours. This topic is endless, bottomless, topless, whatever. Like it's infinite on both directions.
Yeah, it's true. And hey, you've made a whole career out of it for in excess of 10 years, right? So, and many more to come, I'm sure. Okay, that's awesome. So I think we've covered all of the ground that I wanted to cover, Vivek. So we will try and do the downloadable PDF for folks. We may not get it up at exactly the same time as I get the video up, because I'm keen to get this up because folks are waiting for it, but we'll eventually get there. And I guess I'll also say that I'm sure people will ask questions and put comments into this video as well. So I'm sure I'll be driving you crazy with follow-up questions that people have asked me. And obviously I can't answer because I'm not a software development manager, but you're awesome. And do you want to drop in some information in case anybody hasn't looked at our SDE video? Do you want to drop in some information about SDE skills and where people can find you and that type of bit as well before we close off the session? So tell folks where can they find you? What else do you know?
Absolutely. So the best way to reach me would be LinkedIn. My DMs are open, but they're flooded. So please bear with me if I don't respond to you in time. And what I'd appreciate is being very specific about why you're reaching out. Like a hi or a hello would most likely get ignored, because when I triage it, that's like I can't respond to a hi. That doesn't make sense. But if you're very specific about what you want and what you're looking for, I might be able to direct you somewhere very quickly, or I might actually engage and chat with you. So that's one of the ways you can reach me specifically. But I definitely want to point you to the SDE skills community. If you are an engineer, then that's what the community is for. But as a manager, I think we do have a lot of TPMs and development managers in the community as well. So you would find a lot of support there. It's a 8,000 plus member plus Discord community. It's a group of people. They get together. They practice coding interviews every day. They practice system design over the weekends, and then there's mock interviews as well, and things like that. So as a manager, you can engage with folks, and this is like, it'll help you with improving your coding skills, and it'll also help you with your system design skills. But again, remember the deltas and the differences I talked about. Like, you don't need to code like an engineer. You don't need to design like an engineer. So those are the elements that you're thinking about. And the website is sdaskills.com. And if you want to get a link to invitation to the Discord, you just go sdaskills.com/Discord. And yeah, so this has been a fun conversation, Gigi. Thank you for having me here.
So thanks, Vivek. That was awesome. And I'm being blinded by the setting sun here in the UK. I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for being here. And I'm sure folks will start to reach out. I'll definitely let everybody know where to find you. Thank you for your time. And maybe we'll see you again at some other session. I'm quite keen to see if I can do a few more round tables rather than just one-to-one. So maybe we'll be able to invite you back again because you're always a fantastic guest.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. This was super fun, as I said, and I'm always looking forward to chatting with you.
Cool. I'm going to end the broadcast now. Thank you very much, Vivek. Please stay safe. Bye.